To the reader. This is a draft translation of a long and intricate document. Due to the level of interest in Zhangrun's outspoken views among English-language readers, the following has been produced in a matter of days, whereas in the normal course of events, a work that is the result of deep thought and reflection, and informed by a lifetime of experience on the part of the author, would require weeks of dedicated effort for any translator to do it justice. In undertaking this task, I am particularly grateful to Warren Sun, an old friend, who is himself a writer of elegant Chinese and a noted expert on the intricacies both of Chinese history and politics. As my energies lagged and my ability was found wanting, Warren's alacrity, insights, and timely corrections proved invaluable. I would also like to thank Chris Buckley of the New York Times. It goes without saying that for the many infelicities and absurdities of this translation, I bear sole responsibility. Square brackets indicate amplifications and explanations made by the translator. Further revisions of the text and extended annotations will be made over the coming days. The translator. Imminent Fears, Immediate Hopes by Zhangrun. Translated with commentary and notes by Geremie R. Barmé. Yet again, people throughout China, including the entire bureaucratic class, are feeling a sense of uncertainty, a mounting anxiety in relation both to the direction the country is taking as well as in regard to their personal security. These anxieties have generated something of a nationwide panic. This is primarily due to the fact that in recent years our national orientation, literally the way to establish the state, a term popular among Confucian-oriented thinkers from the Republican era. The communists claim sole proprietorship over the expression, its articulation, and its contents. By using this and other expressions related to modern Chinese history, Zhu indicates that he doesn't limit himself to the party line. Has betrayed the basic principles that I outline below. In fact, we now seem to be heading in the opposite direction from the one that we have previously been taking. In my opinion, these basic principles should not be compromised, and under no circumstances should they be undermined. They are the principles central to the policies formulated by the Communist Party following the Cultural Revolution and during the years that it slowly and painstakingly managed to regain a measure of political legitimacy. Throughout the 3 decades of the Open Door and Reform era, circa 1978 to 2008, these principles proved to be the most appropriate political approach. They reflected a minimum consensus arrived at by the entire populace, on the basis of which the country could enjoy a form of peaceful coexistence. 4 basic principles. So, then, what are the 4 basic principles? First basic principle: security and stability. For 4 decades, the present system has enjoyed a legitimacy based on maintaining basic security and stability. This is why, in the wake of the catastrophe of Mao's rule and the Cultural Revolution, over some 4 decades, hundreds of millions of Chinese have supported the policies of reform and the open door. What we need is continued social order and a clear vision for the nation's future. There must be an end of the tendency to pursue new and repeated political movements, that is, mass mobilization and voluntarist campaigns with short-lived political aims, as well as lawlessness. And that includes cycles of strike-hard campaigns, that have been launched variously in 1983, 1996, 2001, and 2010, aimed at crushing criminals and underworld gangs. It is important for the government to confront increasing signs of social anomie and to maintain social order, while at the same time promoting social reconciliation. Only by so doing can they vouchsafe the basic conditions of normalcy that allow the common people to go about their daily business. Admittedly, these public goods, as ensured by the government, are legitimate. They are essential for the broad spectrum of needs essential for normal life: basic social order, a fair society, employment opportunities, as well as the chance to live with dignity. It is inevitable that with the passage of time and given changing circumstances, people's aspirations are bound to evolve. In the absence of high-tier public products, that is, freedom of expression and an independent judiciary, in short, real democracy, the people of China who have experienced so much turmoil and suffering in the past require the baseline guarantees of safety and stability. Overall, the basic principle of security has been assured, even desirable. After all, people just want to have a peaceful life, make enough for food and clothing, and enjoy a measure of prosperity. All of these things are premised on individuals enjoying a settled environment and living in a reasonable society. Nevertheless, this kind of stable environment and the stability maintenance policies that have been developed to maintain it have in turn generated new problems and revealed their own limitations, creating, in fact, deadly lesions that threaten the political legitimacy of the party state itself. Moreover, for over 3 decades, in particular following Deng Xiaoping's tour of the South, during which he invigorated the process of economic reforms that had stalled following 1989 and the ideological squabbles that ensued, in the spring-summer of 1992, the ruling Communist Party has pursued economic growth, or, as the formula goes, devoted itself to development, focused its energies on construction. Such a policy was pursued for 20 years, and overall it enjoyed for the most part the active collaboration of officialdom and the society as a whole. Despite a few clashes, the average Chinese has been of the opinion that no matter who was in power or who fell from grace, given the orderly succession of bureaucrats, a general feeling grew up over time that national policy priorities would continue to focus on substantive nation building. Thus, when it came down to it, most people were willing to put up with the existing political arrangements. In other words, you hold on to the reins of power, I'll enjoy my personal life. This official popular consensus and collaboration produced the social stability and security that I have been discussing here. That's to say, it's not so much about this dream or that dream, rather it's been about growing the economy and developing the society with an emphasis on nation building. Don't launch any more political campaigns. Let us continue to enjoy a peaceful life. This basic principle is the starting point for the generally held view that the power holders were fulfilling their moral duty to the people. It's on the basis of this premise that the common citizenry of China accepts your rule. Second basic principle: a measure of respect for property rights. Respecting private property and tolerating people's desire to pursue wealth creation is the second basic principle. We went from a time when private property and ownership were regarded as the source of all social evils, during the era of high Maoism from 1956 to 1976, and entered a period that tolerated hundreds of millions of Chinese legitimately pursuing greater personal wealth, and then on to a time when there was the prospect that property rights would even be recognized constitutionally, or as the shorthand puts it, private property would be allowed into recognition by the Constitution. This new approach liberated the natural desires of our people to seek prosperity for themselves and their families. The politics of China embraced the natural human desire for a better life. In these circumstances, not only did the state enjoy massive economic growth, it also made it possible for the state to allocate appropriate funding to science and technology, education, culture, national defense, and the military. Importantly, it also underwrote the massive expenditures of the party state itself. Of course, the average Chinese benefited as their standard of living improved. Such is the legal and legitimate basis upon which China has enjoyed such rapid development. It is also the underlying economic rationale behind why the existing political legitimacy has been tolerated by all of China. After all, this is what people regard as fundamental. Touch whatever you must, just don't touch our wallets. This is a principle universally accepted by humanity at large, for in the modern era, the idea of private property is wedded to the concept of human nature. After the party implemented a raft of policies in the late 1970s in the wake of the Cultural Revolution, as a result of which wrongs were righted and order replaced chaos, a shorthand covering a series of significant policy adjustments, including the rehabilitation of tens of thousands of cadres, intellectuals, and individuals, along with the implementation of new quality-oriented educational policies and the encouragement of basic positive social values, among other things. The conceit of the Communist Party was that, for a time, 1957 to 1976 or 1966 to 1976, it had strayed from its mission to build a united, strong, and prosperous China. This fake history has been central to the party's post-1976 self-mythologizing and to the China story that it now tells. China converted, taking up once more the journey along the broad way of universal human existence. And, lo and behold, verily there is no greater virtue than to realize the error of your ways. Third basic principle: a measure of tolerance for personal freedoms. Over the past decades, civil society has not evolved in China. Whenever there's been an outbreak of anything approaching normalcy, it has been crushed. This has had a profoundly negative impact on the individual growth and political maturation of our citizenry. Politically speaking, things are dire, and the Chinese nation as a whole continues to be seriously diminished as a result. However, personal ethics have, to a great extent, enjoyed a revival. In the economic and private realms, there has been positive growth. Today, people enjoy their liberties of social actors, but not as citizens. This is particularly so in the case of the more economically advanced provinces, where this has been the case for some time. What I mean by the liberties of social actors is that in the private sphere, people can enjoy limited personal freedoms, in particular in regard to normal pleasures such as eating, going about one's daily business, and personal intimacy behind closed doors. There is also latitude in regard to a range of individual choices that have no immediate political dimension. For example, if nothing else, people don't have to be worried about official invigilators interfering with their hairstyles or fashion choices, as they did from 1966. You can also enjoy massage parlors and public baths, travel freely, eat yourself silly, and even indulge in extramarital affairs. In Chinese, the tone of these remarks is, to put it lightly, male-centric. It's all very comfy and petite bourgeois. People have for some time been able to enjoy a general sense of social normalcy and everyday ease. Given the brutal monotony of the Maoist years, when everyone had to be careful to keep it in their pants, you can't be that critical of the fact that people prefer to settling for normal everyday pleasures rather than perilously demanding their true rights as citizens. Again, this relative non-interference in the private sphere is a major contributing factor to why people are willing to tolerate the present political arrangements. And it is in this context that we should also mention how the police use the pretext of, say, cracking down on prostitution to target certain individuals, as in the case of the environmentalist activist Li Yang, who died in custody after being detained by the police for supposedly soliciting a prostitute at a foot massage parlor in Beijing in May 2016. Such policing behavior contributes to an atmosphere of insecurity. Although you might think you've achieved what you want in one particular case, since these stories are reported both in the official and the unofficial media, you end up undermining people's general sense of personal security, so you end up losing more than you gain. Or take the policy to clean up Beijing, launched by Kai Kui, mayor of Beijing and one of Xi Jinping's protégés in late 2017, ostensibly aimed at urban renewal, but for all intents and purposes it was a push against what was derisively referred to as the city's low-end population of itinerant workers and their families. The forced closure and destruction of small shops, convenience stores, and bars was a typical example of vanity politics. That is, political actions that are more for show than practical effect, policies that are aimed either at pleasing other bureaucrats or at currying favor with one's superiors, that allowed the authority to demonstrate his power over the common mass and to pursue an aesthetics of suffering in the process. Don't urban planners in such international metropolises as Hong Kong, London, and Paris allow spaces for open-air trading and business as a matter of course? In a market economy, people all too readily despise poverty, but they tolerate prostitution. Some even chose to amuse themselves to death. They're people who might put on a big show and come across all coy, yet behind closed doors they indulge in the boundless possibilities afforded to them by their obscene wealth, and they do so in the most immoral, mindless, and shameless fashion. Very well, we admit that such debauched phenomena are the price one pays for the existence of consumer society. In the eyes of ordinary people who live average lives, such things are all part and parcel of the modern comedy, or the post-modern farce. They have no choice but to live according to the logic of the market, one that stipulates that everything is a commodity. Fourth basic principle: set term limits for political appointees. For over 3 decades, and despite the evidence of a certain level of social pluralism and a measure of political tolerance at certain points in time, China has in fact experienced no substantial political reform. In essence, the party state is founded on a dictatorial political principles, which at their rotting core are maintained by a philosophy of pitiless struggle and factional infighting. On the surface, this is a political modality with an ugly maw that can only be sated by ruling over and consuming the wealth of the nation. However, due to a constitutional provision introduced following Mao's death and in consideration of the depredations resulting from his lifelong tenure as party chairman, that limited the highest power holders to 2 5-year terms in office, and that includes both the state president and the premier since 2003, when Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao came to power, and with the peaceful transition of leadership from Xing Jimin, who was personally appointed to lead the party state by Deng Xiaoping following the ouster of his predecessor Zhao Ziyang at the time of the 4th of June 1989 Beijing massacre, the country finally experienced 10 years, 2003 to 2012, after which the leadership showed that it was satisfied with 2 5-year terms in power. It finally seemed as though we were coming to regard the situation involving the regularization and peaceful transition of political power as something like a constitutional convention. For once, it was as though the law and our reality were in sync, and that we might now be able to proceed along a set path of regular political turnover. The situation afforded the people of China a measure of political certainty, and it bolstered international confidence due to the fact that our country seemed to be on its way to becoming a modern polity. It should be pointed out that this, and this alone, has, over the last 30 years, been the only tangible example of real political reform and progress in China. Despite all the vacuous hoopla about other kinds of political reform initiatives, the party-state system had otherwise remained immobile. So everyone came to believe that now, no matter who you are or what you do, that is, regardless of how bad or incompetent party and state leaders might prove to be, at most you'll only be in power for 10 years. For the blameless masses of Chinese, they who are humble and as numerous as ants, the people who till the yellow earth tirelessly, their sweaty backs bent beneath the sky, those who live laboring to the end of their days just to keep their families fed, people who are absolutely powerless to resist the might of a highly organized state machine. Now, finally, they had a 10-year rule. There actually seemed as though a quasi-legal measure had been instituted that would prevent the outbreak of yet another period of political instability. Finally, the masses could go about their everyday lives with one less thing to worry about. In summation, reviewing the above, social control based on the maintenance of public order, which, as a public good, is still effective. However, in expanding to become a system of stability maintenance, the methods employed to achieve social control have in effect put entire areas under quasi-martial law, in particular the Tibetan and the Xinjiang Uyghur autonomous regions in West China. The system has become unwieldy as well as economically unviable, proof that this approach has exhausted its potential and is in need of renovation and upgrading. The recent Sino-US trade war has, in particular, revealed underlying weaknesses and the soft underbelly of the system. All of this has only served to exacerbate a widespread sense of insecurity in the society at large. Prior to this, at a high-level meeting, the Communist Party in dialogue with world political parties in 2017, our highest authority declared that political legitimacy cannot be fixed at once, neither can it be taken for granted. This would seem to indicate that the concerned authority is aware of a legitimacy crisis. However, more recently, there has been a definite lack of sensitivity in regard to this issue, coupled with a tendency towards overweening self-confidence. This attitude has found expression in such things as the party's anti-poverty programs, which approach policy issues by using dated methods from the era of old-style mass mobilization campaigns, which pursued short-term political goals at great cost but for scant long-term benefit. This undermines confidence in polity continuity and stability. The limited protection of property rights, along with a basic tolerance of people working to strike it rich, has contributed to economic growth and enhanced the living standards of countless Chinese. But over the last decade, both of these things have encountered the nationwide party polity allowing for the state to advance while the private sector is forced to retreat. That is, a party-led government policy aimed at protecting state-owned enterprises, not on the basis of financial realities, but to guarantee the political role and power of official ideology and the cadreocracy. These policies became more prevalent during and after the global financial crisis. Calls for the reform of SOEs as part of an urgent need for China's further economic transformation have been continuous. In the private sector, people have also witnessed repeated cases of official rapaciousness and the state-sanctioned plundering of private property and wealth. As a reaction, people have increasingly wanted to promote the sanctity of private property. There is now a public awareness that the logic lurking behind all of this is that power cannot be privately held and property should not be public. a line devised by the economist Mao Yuxi and inspired by the ideas of John Locke. And so it is that the division between the public and the private is the basis for social peace. Both are intrinsic to the politics of the past and of the present. Only if China manages to work through this stage of conflict will there be true peace. But in recent times, people have been both critical and fearful of the meaning of the revision of the Constitution in March 2018 and the abandonment of term limits on political leaders, which has in effect allowed State President / General Secretary / Chairman Xi Jinping to enjoy de facto tenure for life. It is felt that this amounts to a negation of the last 30 years of the reform and open-door policy era. It is feared that in one fell swoop, China will be cast back to the terrifying days of one-man rule under Mao. Along with this constitutional revision, there is also a clamor surrounding the creation of a new personality cult, something that in particular has provoked the imminent fears that I outline below. 8 imminent fears. Below, I offer an overview of the major causes of anxiety and panic in contemporary China under 8 topics. Fear 1. Property tremens. Is there any certainty that people will be able to protect the personal wealth they have amassed over the past few decades, regardless of how much it is? Will they be able to maintain their standard of living? Will property rights, as outlined by the law, really be protected by the relevant legislation? Will you be bankrupted or your family destroyed if you happen to fall foul of one of the power holders? A stratum that includes bureaucrats as low down as the committee head of a village. Over time, especially in the past few years, certainty about these issues has decreased, and this has contributed to a sense of panic at all levels of society. Those most concerned are the people who got rich first, during the initial wave of economic reforms in the 1980s. The response of these wealthy individuals has been to immigrate. As for average members of the middle class, although they don't have to worry about basic necessities such as food and clothing, in fact they enjoy a surplus, but like others who are just trying to live a normal life, they are also constantly worried about the unexpected. In particular, they are concerned both about inflation and devaluation, for either way their money could become worthless. The wealthy immigrate for a host of different reasons. Some do so in the pursuit of a better quality of life, others slip away to launder money, while members of the party nomenclatura want to put themselves beyond the reach of the law. But the most common reason for immigrating is born of worry about the safety and security of private wealth. The biggest winners during the decades of the reform policies and the open door has been that particular and peculiar stratum of party bureaucrat cum business tycoon. They have milked the system with consummate skill, and they make up the lion's share of the migrating uber-rich. The official media carefully limits the information about all of this, but popular grumbling is rife, and added to that, the propagandists still time and again strum the old tune about the ultimate goal of communism being the abolition of private property, to which the hysterical populists add the old revolutionary slogan, "Overthrow the wealthy, divide the spoils." All of these mixed messages simply exacerbate the sense of anxiety among property owners. Then, smack in the middle of all this anxiety, it has been truly marvelous to witness the pinnacle, that is, the members of the ruling Communist Party Politburo, sitting themselves down for a collective study session devoted to the Communist Manifesto. On 23rd of April 2018, the 5th collective study session of the Politburo, elected by the 19th Party Congress the previous October, was devoted to this topic. It's only here and now in China that a dazzling work written by 2 wildly talented young authors Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, one that absolutely unsettled the status quo when it first appeared, can truly be appreciated as it both explains things and shakes the equanimity of just about everyone in the country. Fear 2. Putting politics back in command. For the authorities to emphasize yet again policies that put politics in command, a Mao-era strategy dating from the Great Leap Forward in 1958 that required the nation to orient itself entirely according to party policies. It was put in practice through mass political movements and class-based politics, and abandon the fundamental national policy in favor of developing the economy is what I mean by Fear 2. In recent years, the gunpowder-like stench of militant ideology has become stronger. It reeks of what is fashionably termed taking the lead to achieve discursive hegemony, that is, the right of the voices of those in power to speak over all others, although in reality it is a perverse use of the public to impose ideological punishment on private citizens. This has already led to a universal dread being felt in the intellectual sphere. Given this situation, coupled with ever-increasing emphasis on self-criticism, that is, formulaic rituals in the workplace during which people are pressured to negate openly what are deemed to be private failings, and then pretend to measure all one's thoughts, words, and deeds against the party's ever-changing ideological catechism, the publishing industry has already experienced severe contractions, and the silencing of the media more generally is becoming worse by the day. This state of affairs is also increasingly hindering exchanges between China and the outside world. We are even seeing examples of official propaganda in which children are encouraged to report on their parents in flagrant violation of normal ethical relations. Such an approach is a betrayal both of our traditions and of our present aspirations. In this day and age, one would have thought it to be unthinkable, but this vile totalitarian mien brings to mind the barbarism of the Cultural Revolution. The influence of such propaganda is seeping throughout the society, and some university lecturers have been singled out and repeatedly punished for what they say in lectures. They now live in trepidation, ever fearful that the party's ideological watchdogs in their institutions or student spies will report them. Even more serious is the fact that local bureaucrats, afraid of making political mistakes, are being forced into passivity. In reality, China's economic development is dependent on the political engagement and achievements of just such local cadres, men and women who are dedicated to and believe in development. While over there the remnants of the highly politicized Chongqing model, promoted by Bo Xilai, former party chief of Chongqing, who in 2011 to 2012 was in competition with Xi Jinping to rule the party, and then subsumed by Xi's own gimcrack policies, was a social political formula that encouraged political revanchism in the tandem with harsh policing as part of a strategy to mobilize, manipulate, and control the population, are working hand in glove with three types of people who are active in the Cultural Revolution era: Red Guard rebels, factional opportunists, and violent thugs and thieves. These categories of extremists were denounced by Deng Xiaoping in the late 1970s, but in many cases they went unpublished for their deeds. In the tertiary education sector, with a sleight of hand and consummate skill, they have become a burgeoning force that disguises itself as new leftism, and they are baying for blood. Painful memories of political movements still linger in the minds of average citizens of a certain age. Younger people are engrossed in urban life and are accustomed to a suitable modicum of economic comfort, They have absolutely no interest in or awareness of the lurking totalitarian tendencies undergirded by the illogicality of a new manufactured push to put politics in command. If you force them to pay attention to such things, it will have the opposite of the desired effect and repulse them. In reality, over past decades, people's thinking has been fairly unified, and, as noted a number of times, the reason that the present political system has come to be tolerated is because it is focused on economic construction, been devoted to development, and has no longer been obsessed with a constant quasi-movement mentality that constantly tried to impose political proselytizing on everyone. That had eventually come to an end, or at least its interference in the private sphere was reduced. People knew that there would be no more crazy talk about preferring the weeds of socialism over the sprouts of capitalism. The Gang of Four member Zhang Zhonghui's 1975 slogan that promoted a tolerance of the wastefulness and irrationalities of the socialist command economy over the iniquities, efficiencies, and benefits of the market. Ultimately, economic development as the core should by all rights evolve towards a core desire to pursue a constitution-based rule of law, and it is on that basis that politics and economy should work together to build a truly modern nation. Thereby, the two will be like joint handmaidens at the birth of modern China. However, in the present circumstances, what is necessary for the former, that is, economic development, to be maintained unstintingly, it is unthinkable that other plans should be afoot, or that anyone could be considering a volte-face. Fear 3. Class struggle again. Starting a few years ago, the official media and party ideologues began to talk again about class struggle, that is, imposing artificial socio-political categories on individuals and groups, and demonizing, ostracizing, or otherwise scapegoating them for political and economic ends. By now, people have been anxious about this for ages. The general thrust of politics in recent times has led people to speculate about the possible revival of the farrago of class struggle-based politics of the kind pursued by Stalin and Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong is a classically styled derogatory name for Mao Zedong. The author has substituted the name of Mao's birthplace, Shaoshan, in Hunan province, for his personal name. Even worse is that, given the continued pursuit of the anti-corruption campaign, initiated by party leaders under Xi Jinping from early 2013, and in particular with the establishment of this new and all-powerful National Supervisory Commission, formally inaugurated in March 2018, a party-state institution that which will wield authority over all government employees and teachers, and use politically determined goals to exercise nationwide control, people feel no greater security in their legal rights. In fact, it's quite the opposite. They can't help but think that these developments are an augury foretelling the advent of a form of KGB-style control under a secretive party bureaucracy that will itself become embroiled in the factional politics of the Communist Party. As a result, people are panicked about the fact that we may be returning to the long-gone days of class struggle. This is why so many are feeling increasingly alienated from the country's political life. The overall social atmosphere of peace and harmony is under threat. After all, memories of a political model that was based on constant pitiless struggle under the Communist Party itself from 1949 to 1978, and in reality during the mini-purges of the 1980s and beyond, remains fresh, and the concern that it could well be reimposed on China is real. Given the two-term limit imposed on state leaders, formally stipulated by the Constitution, a regulation that would normally have resulted in a defined 10-year period of rule for Xi Jinping, but which was abandoned in 2018, and the continuation of an orderly politics of succession within the Communist Party itself, People were hopeful that China would continue to move in the direction of becoming a normal and normalized country, one in which both property rights and human rights would over time be granted appropriate expression in and protection by the Constitution. It was assumed that the old mantra of ceaseless struggle had lost its power. But these years, it seems as though yet again we are moving in the opposite direction from the one we were previously headed in. Not surprisingly, there is widespread alarm. Fear 4. A new closed-door policy. Just as we at loggerheads with the United States, the representative of the Western world, China is engaging in renewed intimacy with heinous regimes like North Korea. China's economic development and social progress are part and parcel of this nation's self-advancement as a civilization. This is a continuation of the logic of the civilizational transformation that has been taking place in China for over 150 years, one that has seen a backward nation once more participate in the unfolding global system. It isn't something authored or directed by external forces, but in terms of practical policy, from the late 1970s, China reinvigorated policies and ideas related to reform and the open door, which had been integral to previous efforts to modernize the nation from the mid-19th century, dating from the years of the Tongji Restoration and again during the self-strengthening movement that was related to that restoration. Concomitantly, relations with the West improved and moved in a progressive direction, so that China would, as the slogan of the Zhangrun era when China worked to join the WTO put it, to be able to be integrated within the global community, and in the process accept its norms and practices. This was brought about by fast-tracking development as part of the globalization of economic activity. If it were not for the fact that the open door forced ever greater reform, meaning that the pressures brought to bear on the Chinese system by its global trade policies were constantly putting pressure on the party state to extend, often reluctantly, its internal economic and structural reform agenda, China would not enjoy the economic, social, and cultural prosperity that it does today. Now, for China to buddy up to failed states and totalitarian regimes like North Korea and Venezuela not only goes against the popular will, it flies in the face of the tide of history. Indeed, it lacks wisdom. Given the anomalies of the present situation, ordinary folk are scathing when they mock a situation in which large swaths of the cadreocracy and their progeny long ago squirreled away wealth in those very foreign climes that are officially being attacked, that is, North America, and that's why they are not overly concerned about rising tensions in the Sino-US relationship. However, if by chance there is some major slip-up in the Sino-US relationship, China as a whole will suffer, as will the nation's wealth, something that, theoretically at least, belongs to all the people. Regardless, the effects will be felt by ordinary Chinese men and women. They will be hurt in the pocket. What really lies at the root cause of this hubristic behavior of allowing tensions with the US to increase while diplomatically embracing North Korea is that the requirements of the one political party, that is, the Communists, outweigh the reasonable and rational needs of the nation. To disguise this reality, a twisted statist logic is employed by the party-state propaganda machine to repress and pervert popular common sense. With no real will to pursue the reform process in a positive fashion, yet harboring a dogged determination to indulge in their own willfulness, the powers that be have been failing to keep up with the currents of modern thought, and so the folly continues, understandably, inevitably. Fear 5. Excessive international aid. Over-investment in international aid may well result in deprivations at home. It is said that China is now the world's largest source of international aid, Its cash splashes are counted in billions or tens of billions of dollars. For a developing country with a large population, many of whom still live in a pre-modern economy, such behavior is outrageously disproportionate. Such policies are born of a vanity politics. They reflect the flashy showmanship of the boastful, and they are odious. The nation's wealth, including China's $3 trillion in foreign reserves, has been accumulated over the past 4 decades using the blood and sweat of working people. In fact, it has actually been built up as a result of successive policies and countless struggles dating from the time of the self-strengthening movement, launched during the Tongji Restoration during the 1860s, when, following its defeat in the Second Opium War, the court of the Qing dynasty adopted the first modernizing reform agenda in Chinese history. By saying this, Xu, to an extent, indicates that he does not completely embrace the communist narrative or its soteriology. How can this wealth be squandered so heedlessly? The era of fast-paced economic growth will come to an end. How can such wanton generosity be tolerated? A generosity which, in many ways, replicates the vainglorious Maoist-era policies when China boasted that it was the center of world revolution to support Asia, Africa, Latin America, which meant that an impoverished China was generously giving aid to third-world countries in an effort to gain political advantage and counter the influence both of the American imperialists and the Soviet revisionists, that led to countless millions of Chinese being forced to tighten their belts simply to survive, and which even saw the corpses of those who had starved to death scattered in the fields. Following the recent outbreak of the Sino-US trade war, the official state media has called on the nation to overcome the present difficulties in a spirit of unity, a slogan that has been widely mocked. Added to that, there's all that grand pontificating, expressed by using a common quote from an essay by the Song Dynasty writer Fan Zhongyang, about how one should put the cares of the nation ahead of the enjoyment of the individual. The masses have responded by deriding such nonsense mercilessly. "Fuck you," you hear people say. "What the hell does that have to do with anything?" Such sentiments reflect popular sentiment. People can't be duped like the hapless and uncomplaining subjects of yesteryear. Fear 6. Repression of the intelligentsia. There has been a leftward, that is, repressive, Mao-era-like, turn in policies related to the intelligentsia, along with a renewed imposition of thought reform, like that first imposed by the party from 1952 when university professors, employees, and people in the state bureaucracy were required to accept party dogma and then to parrot it both in dedicated study sessions and publicly. Although it has been long said that intellectuals, a broad category including many who are educated as well as educators, are part of the working class. This was party policy until the high Maoist years from 1957 to 1976, during which intellectuals were regarded as dangerous ideological enemies. Deng Xiaoping championed the role and status of the educated technocratic elite again from 1977. But when there's the slightest policy tremor, once more they are unfairly targeted, or indeed treated like the enemy. The way intellectuals are regarded has long been the regnant dynasty's most reliable political barometer. It reflects the basic tenor of the nation's life. The Ministry of Education has repeatedly declared that it is necessary to intensify ideological education among educators, so that they in turn inculcated the correct political ideas and attitudes among their students. Online speculation holds that returnee teachers who have studied overseas are seen as a particular threat. Meanwhile, a small clutch of remnant leftists, new leftists and anti-humanists who support various aspects of a revived Maoist ideology, some of the most famous of which are celebrated in the left-leaning International Academy, in the tertiary sector are jumping for joy, It's as though they have been given a new lease on life. Literally, it's as though they've been injected with chicken blood, a satirical reference to late Cultural Revolution era quackery. See Joel Martinson injecting chicken blood. They are bounding around in a bloodthirsty frenzy. All these phenomena contribute to an atmosphere of fear, a trepidation among intellectuals that enforced ideological reform, that is, the demand for intellectual conformity, is making a comeback. The leftward turn in educational policy and a mooted thought reform movement may indicate that even more extreme developments are on the cards. The old expression, inappropriate discussions, is once more a term bandied about with a deadening effect. The result is that people are being scared into silence. The ban on inappropriate discussions of the major policies of the center of the party state came into force from late 2015, when the Communist Party General and its disciplinary commission issued warnings against and stipulated the punishment of idle speculation about party policy, leaders, and factional infighting. In an atmosphere such as this, how can there be any freedom of speech? Without intellectual freedom and the independent spirit, an expression taken from Chen Yin-Kui's epitaph for Wang Xiaowei, and a long-cherished formulation embraced by China's intellectual liberals from the 1980s, one that has its roots in the Republican era when it was celebrated in particular by academics at Tsinghua University. What hope is there for people to explore the unknown, for the advancement of scholarship, or for intellectual creativity? Up until recently, given the positive legacy of the past 4 decades, one that should be further enhanced by the concerted efforts of the next few generations, there was good reason to believe that in the future Chinese civilization could well enjoy an extraordinary peak of achievement, in terms both of its intellectual and its scholastic life. However, if the present policies that clamp down on free speech continue, or are extended further, these hopes will remain unrealized. China will be little more than a cultural backwater of intellectual dwarfs. Fear 7. A new arms race and the danger of war, including another Cold War. Over the last decade, Asia has, as a whole, for all intents and purposes, entered an arms race. Fortunately, the probability of war has so far been maintained within acceptable parameters. The main issue for China is that we cannot afford to interrupt our developmental trajectory or to further frustrate the great modern transformation that has been unfolding for nearly 2 centuries, just as it is within sight of being realized. Over the past 2 years, I have written 2 essays, Don't Let Civil War Break Out in China, and Protect the Reform Policies and the Open Door, in which I argued that China has added a system of military preparedness to its previously existing stability maintenance regime. I did so in an effort to point out the inherent dangers in this development and to forewarn of its negative consequences. At the moment, as the political atmosphere of China is becoming increasingly repressive, and the country is entangled in a foreign trade dispute, there is an increased possibility of an economic downturn, something that could lead to things that are beyond control and that may have various unintended consequences. In such a situation, it is not unreasonable to be afraid that matters could result in some form of military conflict, be it either a hot or a cold war. One should be mindful of the need to prevent such an outcome. Popular wisdom argues that a trade conflict between China and the United States should not be used as a pretext by the propagandists and policy advisors for heightened ideological contestation, nor should there be a competition over which side has a superior political system. I think my earlier concerns have recently been justified by the evidence of such developments. Fear 8. The end of reform and a return to totalitarianism. Even though the word reform is somewhat tarnished, and despite the fact that even rather reprehensible polities use it as camouflage, Nonetheless, given the discursive environment of contemporary China, and the fact that we are at a time in the country's life when the Great Transformation requires a final push, and compared to the outbreak of some explosive revolution or a transgression in the form of extreme leftism, reform is and remains the most prudent and promising way forward. The engine of reform, however, has been idling for the last few years. If it isn't used to propel us forward, we will go into reverse. In fact, this state of affairs has become the hallmark of the last term, that is, Xi Jinping's first term in office from 2012 to 2017. Given the overall direction being taken, people may be entirely justified in asking whether the reform policies and the open door have reached the end of their history, and will totalizing politics now return in their stead? Who knows? At the moment, this question is of the greatest concern to the largest number of Chinese. During the Hu Jintao Wen Zhibao debacle from 2003 to 2012, it seemed as though the totalitarian was transitioning towards the authoritarian. That's why some dubbed the resulting arrangement as a post-totalitarian 360-degree authoritarian political system. Over the last 2 years, however, we have seen things moving in the opposite direction. Ergo, the widespread anxiety that we may all be witnessing a thoroughgoing return to totalitarian politics. Modern Chinese history teaches us that at first, because of the Sino-Japanese War of 1894, and then with the anti-Japanese War of Resistance starting in 1937, China's advance towards modernity was interrupted. Those wars put paid to any hope that the country could enjoy a normal political life. Modernity was derailed. Now we are approaching the final stages of a profound transformation that has unfolded over nearly 2 centuries, starting with the political and military disruptions of the Daoguang era of the Manchu Qing dynasty and the First Opium War of 1840. We need a final push to achieve the goal, a point that the anxious author has already made a number of times. Under no circumstances can the nation be derailed again by yet more military conflict. If that were to happen, when might history present us with another opportunity? Heaven only knows. Alright, fuck it, we'll read the rest of it. 8 immediate hopes. In outlining the above anxieties and the broadly felt sense of panic, I have focused on the domestic political realm. I have not expanded my considerations to discuss matters related to the economy or trade, including the question of massive tax cuts, nor have I touched on the provocative themes of democracy and rule of law. Below, I will confine myself to offering a series of concrete policy suggestions, that is, hopes, that I believe are of timely importance. The first hope: put a stop to empty grand gestures and wasteful international largesse. Average Chinese are most frequently offended by the way the state scatters large sums of money through international aid to little or no benefit. China is still slowly making its way up the steep slope of development, in terms both of basic infrastructure and social facilities, as well as in regard to people's ability to access welfare. We are confronting massive problems. Our burden is great, and the road ahead leads far into the distance. And I make this point without even mentioning the crisis in aged care, or issues related to employment opportunities and education. Rural destitution is a widespread and crushing reality. Greater support through public policy initiatives is essential. Without major changes, half of China will remain in what is basically a pre-modern economic state. That will mean that the hope to create a modern China will remain unfulfilled, if not half-hearted. If this situation continues, what good is it to talk about the great revival of Chinese civilization? At the recent China-Arab States Cooperation Forum in 2018, the Chinese leadership, that is, Xi Jinping, announced that $20 billion would be made available for dedicated reconstruction projects in the Arab world. On top of that, Xi Jinping declared that a further 1 billion yuan will be offered to support social stability efforts in the region. Everyone knows full well that the Gulf states are literally oozing with wealth. Why is China, a country with over 100 million people who are still living below the poverty line, playing at being the flashy big spender? How can the Chinese not comment in astonishment? Just what is the supreme bureaucratic authority thinking? Don't they care about our own people? Furthermore, the people who indulge in such grand and expensive gestures evince no respect for existing budgetary procedures or institutional formalities. In the process, they shunt aside a National People's Congress that is constitutionally empowered to maintain budgetary oversight. In the process, existing institutionalized bureaucratic mechanisms are for all intents and purposes paralyzed. It is akin to a declaration of war on the authority of the Constitution and the rule of law. The second hope: put an end to diplomatic extravagance. Even the most commonplace international meeting organized in China involves extraordinary levels of expense. There is no regard for budgets. Fiscal waste and the heedless loss of human work hours is considerable. Such activities are content-free and superficial. It's all about pursuing vanity politics, not practical politics, let alone hard-edged politics. Such events have nothing to do with the so-called venerable traditional of warmth and hospitality demonstrated by the Chinese people from ancient times. Only the most vain and self-serving leaderships and bureaucrats like to indulge in such things. If foreigners were to copy what we are constantly doing here, then the VIP field headquarters of the United Nations in New York would be on police lockdown 24/7. And the headquarters of the numerous international organizations based in Geneva and Paris would perforce have to stage nightly fireworks displays with their personnel expected to be decked out in their finery all the time. As independent entities, countries should aim for validation by means of their actual national strength, and thereby they can pursue their own national interest through regular international activities, whilst in the process also exhibiting certain values and moral probity. All of these things can coexist, and they can have a net benefit for one's people. The glory and respect will come naturally. To lack this breadth of understanding, and devote instead considerable energy to political grandstanding, even though the host himself might feel very smug, it is nonetheless a waste of human resources. It is the behavior of a wastrel who is careless of public finance. Moreover, such excessive displays actually elicit contempt from foreign guests. They serve merely to excite popular outrage among one's own people. Even our lard-ass neighbor, Kim Jong-un, a loathsome dictator ostracized by the international community, was welcomed to Beijing with an extravagant motorcade. You can see it all in the print and the electronic media. Gossip even has it that top-tier special Mao Tei, valued at 1.28 million yuan a bottle, was served at the official banquet. To be quite frank, this one gesture offended and alienated untold numbers of people in China. Now, as for the so-called China Dream, all I can say is dream on. The third hope: end the privileges of the party nobility. Elitist privileges for retired high-level cadres should be eliminated. The system of the present dynasty allows for the state to provide inclusive retirement to grave care for high-level cadres according to a standard that is far and away above that allowed to the average citizen. These cadres retain the privileges they enjoyed during their working lives, including premium healthcare and special access to luxury resorts for recreation and holidays. Everyone is aware of the financial burden this places on the people, but the details are never released for fear of sparking public outrage. This system replicates the kinds of prerogative that were provided to the imperial Zhou family lineage during the Ming dynasty, founded by Zhu Yangzhuan in 1368 CE, as well as the emoluments permitted to the families of the Eight Banners, the exclusive Manchu military and administrative groups that were crucial to the founding and rule of the Qing dynasty in 1644. These privileges continued until the abdication of the royal house in 1912. This is not merely a betrayal of the self-advertised revolutionary spirit, it is also in breach of modern standards of civic life. What's all that talk of the remnants of feudalism for? This is a perfect example of it. People are outraged but powerless to do anything about it, and it's one of the main reasons why people regard the system itself with utter contempt. On one side of the hospital, commoners face the challenge of gaining admission for treatment, while everyone knows that grand suites are reserved on the other side for the care of high-level cadres. The people observe this with mute and heartfelt bitterness. Every iota of this bottled-up anger may, at some unexpected moment, explode with thunderous fury. The fourth hope. End the system of luxury provisioning. Eliminate the system of special needs or luxury goods provisioning, starting in the wartime communist guerrilla base Yan'an some 70 years ago. This system, whereby party cadres and government bureaucrats have been permitted privileged access to goods and services depending on their rank in a 27-tier network, continued unimpeded, even during times of mass famine and deprivation, and it continues even now, as the countless masses are ever increasingly concerned about the quality and access to dairy products for their babies, and the hygiene and safety of their everyday foodstuffs. The special needs provisioning system allows the high-level party nobility access to a vast range of specialty products far beyond the dreams of the average person. Apart from a few totalitarian polities, there is no other country that does this like China. Surely this is a case of luxury in the extreme and shamelessness that defies description. Of course, inequalities exist in all societies, and disparities in ability and wealth are only natural, but they are the result of differences, not due to the fact that the ideal playing field imagined by our citizens does allow for a level starting point. And none of this even takes into account the outrage felt because a small group of party grandees is being continuously mollycoddled by a political party dipping into the coffers of the state. As long as this system, and number 34, a code word for the regulations covering special access to necessities and luxury goods provided by the party nomenclatura, which was set up after 1955, remains unchecked, real food safety in China will never be realized. Neither side will really be assured of its long-term security. The fifth hope. Require officials to divulge their personal assets. People have been calling for a law requiring officials to gazette their assets for many years, without effect. It was also an early demand of student protesters in 1989. It is evident that this is where the real skullduggery takes place, and that is why the truth cannot be revealed. As cadres and government bureaucrats scale the ladder of officialdom, there is a complete lack of transparency about the personal assets that accrue to their children and their families. This is a closely guarded secret hidden deep in the party's personnel files. Normal people have no knowledge of what is really going on, and everything is clouded in obfuscation. In terms of the state's ability and economic wherewithal, let alone in terms of technical ability, all is in readiness to reveal the truth. What's required is for the system to be activated. Thereupon, via the national internet, and with the oversight of 1.4 billion pairs of eyes, everything would immediately become clear. Despite continued anti-corruption activities, boundless new cases of corruption are constantly being generated. That is because both the anti-corruption push as well as the corrupt activities themselves take place internally and secretly. None involve a legal process based on the principles of open and transparent politics. What is missing is a sunshine policy. If you have nothing to hide, then implement such a policy and everything will finally be out in the open. If you are truly sincere, then join the majority of other countries who have signed up to the anti-money laundering Egmont group of financial intelligence units. Why conceal yourselves in the obfuscating mists of rhetoric and treat the vast multitudes of China like simpletons? The sixth hope. Put a stop to the new personality cult immediately. An emergency brake must be applied to the unfolding personality cult. Who would have thought that after 4 decades of reforms and the open door, our sacred land would once more witness a personality cult? The party media is going to extreme lengths to create a new idol, and in the process it is offering up to the world an image of China as modern totalitarianism. Portraits of the leader are hoisted high throughout the land, as though they are possessed of some spiritual manner. This only adds to all the absurdity, and then on top of that, the speeches of that official, things previously merely to be recorded by secretaries in a pro forma bureaucratic manner, are now painstakingly collected in finely bound editions printed in vast quantities and handed out free throughout the world. The profligate waste of paper alone is enough to make you shake your head in disbelief. All of this reflects the low IQ of the concerned official and his craving for fame. More importantly, we need to ask how a vast country like China, one that was previously so ruinously served by a personality cult under Mao Zedong, simply has no resistance to this new cult, and this includes the droves of theoreticians and researchers. In fact, they are outdoing themselves with their sickeningly slavish behavior, literally licking the carbuncles and sucking liquid from the ulcers of the power holder to gain favor and solicit reward. It's as though hundreds of millions of Chinese are oblivious. People tolerate the new cult and allow it unfettered freedom. They are powerless in the face of all those ass-kissing bureaucrats. It goes to show that China's enlightenment is far from over. Every generation must champion rationalism in public affairs and continue painstakingly to forge a way to the future. The new cult is clear evidence that China faces a long struggle before it can claim to be a modern, secular, and rational nation-state. The seventh hope. Restore term limits for the national presidency. International opinion was astounded by the decision made earlier in the year to revise the constitution and abandon the term limits set for the state presidency. In China, it resulted in widespread and profound anxiety. Overnight, it seemed as though we were shocked awake after a 4-decade-long dream. Suddenly, as if out of nowhere, we had a supreme leader with no checks on his power. How could people not have all kinds of strange imaginings and new fears? It is for this reason that I urge that at an appropriate time during this or the coming year, say, for instance, at a special meeting of the National People's Congress this autumn, or the scheduled annual convocation of the Congress in March 2019, a further revision of the Constitution should be made so as to reinstate the term limit on the presidency. To do so would vouchsafe the policies of the reform and open door era, while frustrating the slide towards totalitarian politics of the Cultural Revolution. We have a constitution, and regardless of its quality, it is, after all, the nation's basic law, and should not be revised willy-nilly. However, it is still a temporary constitution that was formulated by a political arrangement during what has in effect been a crucial transitional period in the nation's life. Therefore, it cannot but be repeatedly subject to revision. Hopefully, this will be the final necessary revision of the Constitution before the eventual transition to democracy is achieved. The eighth hope. Overturn the verdict on 4th of June. Overturn the verdict on the 4th of June, the 1989 Beijing massacre. Over this and next year, China will mark a series of sensitive anniversaries. It will be the 4th decade since the policies of what would become known as the Reforms and Open Door, the centenary of the May 4th movement of 1919, a major feature of which was modern student activism and strident patriotism. It was also a contributing reason for the founding of the Chinese Communist Party in 1921, as well as the 30th anniversary of 4th of June. The upshot of the Sino-US trade war will extend through this period and will only serve to add to the uncertainty of things. In pursuit of the usual posture of stability maintenance, the authorities will, dare say, use policing methods to deal with political issues, in the process of which they will deploy the mechanisms of the state machine to clamp down on the political situation. The system will go to extremes, rather than by approaching things by dealing with politics by employing politics, as we witness in the West when they deal with difficult political issues. Back in the day, the 5th of April, 1976 Tiananmen incident, when protesters flooded to Tiananmen to mourn the recently deceased Premier Zhou Enlai and denounced Mao and his coterie, later known as the Gang of Four, was re-evaluated, and ever since then that date has no longer been one of any particular political sensitivity. This was precisely because, after Mao's death, the authorities confronted a political problem by employing a political solution. As the old saying puts it, when an army approaches a good general, knows how to block its advance. When the waters rise, we know how to sandbag against flooding. Everyone took from that decision regarding the Tiananmen incident what they wanted and were all satisfied. That's why, in light of the upcoming 30th anniversary of 4th of June in 2019, I would encourage those in power to find a suitable moment either this or next year to rehabilitate 4th of June publicly. That is, to re-evaluate an event which is still officially classified as a necessary military action launched to quell a counter-revolutionary rebellion by hooligans in Beijing against the Chinese state with the aim of toppling the Communist Party. This would not only demonstrate a sincere and wise application of the principle of politics embracing the political, it would also mean that from then on there would be no need to treat the 4th of June every year like a political emergency. The authorities, that is, Xi Jinping, would clear the way for all Chinese to enjoy a peaceful coexistence. It would uplift people psychologically and benefit the party state by accruing political capital to its legitimacy. The hopes outlined above merely articulate what one would call contemporary political common sense. They also reflect widespread appeals and desires within the population at large. Herein I am, to use an old expression, putting my life on the line, simply to say what everyone knows and thinks. In this vast world of great disorder, if there is no reasonable way to express such views, then there can be no reasonable way to legitimate them through appropriate legislation. And in that case, neither I nor the masses have a way to live without fear. What to do? Alas and alack indeed. In what is a period of transition? Don't panic just yet, since over the past 2 years, the world has entered a mini-cycle of political adjustment. The dust has far from settled. For China to get through this period, what is of crucial importance is that the nation must continue along its chosen path of sustained internal reform, while focusing on raising the standard of living and ameliorating the well-being of the people. What matters for China and the world is that this particular grand ship of state continues to catch the wind in its sails as it peacefully steers a course on the way to continued political normality. Conflict and warfare are part and parcel of the inherently violent nature of the human animal. The sacred duty of politicians living during a period of historical opportunity like today is to delay or avoid entirely the outbreak of hostilities. This is a great test for the wisdom and moral probity of the meat-eaters, an ancient term from pre-dynastic times that refers to the social and political elite who, according to court regulations, were permitted to eat meat. Human beings are, above all, political animals, and politics is the ultimate expression of human ingenuity. What is necessary in the here and now is that no matter what the present situation happens to be, we cannot allow ourselves to deviate from the grand course of peaceful development. We have a period of historic opportunity that can only be seized on by the wise. We don't need heedless antagonism. At all costs, we must not cast aside the good hand that we have been dealt. The great powers on either side of the Pacific, China and the United States, now find themselves, by chance, under the rule of the old Red Guards. This is a somewhat baffling description, first in regard to Donald Trump, a roux whose tone is more tangerine than red, and secondly, mystifying in the case of Xi Jinping, who was more of a blackguard, that is, from a family under attack in the early Cultural Revolution, than a red guard. This is and can only something that happens in a transitional moment. It's the typical kind of unruly coincidence that occurs during periods of heightened historical drama. On this side of the ocean, we have one who has no real historical awareness or truly modern political sensibility, let alone a moral vision that reflects an awareness of the principles of universal civilization. The one is blind to the grand way of current affairs, and is scarred indelibly by a political brand from the Cultural Revolution. Overweening pride and official competence leads this one to bend his efforts to serve the wrong ends, talented enough to play the bureaucratic game and doubtlessly masterful at achieving high office. But as for guarding the nation along the correct path, what the one does is worse than arrant time-wasting, for there is something perverse at work. And there, on the other side of the Pacific, a crowd of the ghoulish undead, nurtured on the politics of the Great Game and the Cold War, have taken the stage. Certainly they have their own analysis of world affairs, and particular understanding of the cultural upheavals of today, but like their opposite number here, they lack a truly historical perspective. They are short-sighted and avaricious. Since their diagnosis is faulty, the prescriptions that they offer are completely off the mark, trained in a mercantilism that favored the capitalist elite, with a personality amplified by bloated self-regard and the lifetime habits of rapaciousness. The result is a person possessed of a prideful quasi-imperial mindset that is coupled to heinous vulgarity. We now have to deal with the crudest of blackmailers, a person who knows no shame. What, therefore, in the case of the United States today, we are presented with is but a degraded civilization under the tutelage of a flailing and desperate imperialism that is itself in terminal decline. Their boastful and vainglorious patriotism stokes the fires of national disaster. We know them all too well as patriot scoundrels. Literally patriot thieves, a kind of shyster who boastfully promotes themselves while sullying everything in the guise of loyalty. Be it China or abroad, in the present or in the past, we've seen their kind before. One is reminded of those recent jokes about how bad people have gotten older, a reference to a popular comic observation that it's not that old people have suddenly turned bad, it's just that bad people have gotten older. Everyone is the product of the education they receive. So, for the old Red Guard, on that side of the ocean, Donald Trump, there's no way he can break out of those self-made shackles. He simply doesn't give a damn, on top of which he's completely lacking in self-awareness. Dealing with new problems within the framework of an out-of-touch mindset, while nonetheless exuding supreme confidence, inevitably makes the mistakes of the willful. Their ideas and policies are, as Alexis de Tocqueville said, nothing more than a load of musty debris. Note: like autocrats elsewhere, Chinese Communist Party leaders are fascinated by the history of regime collapse. shortly after joining the Standard Committee of the party's ruling Politburo in late 2012, and as head of the Central Disciplinary Commission charged with oversight of Xi Jinping's signature anti-corruption campaign, Wang Zhishang, recommended that his underlings study de Tocqueville's The Old Regime and the French Revolution. At this moment, taking stock of the general tenor of discussion in the Chinese-speaking world and the mindset that it reflects, it is evident that a kind of political awareness based on civilian rationalism has come into maturity, nor is it lacking in proud righteousness. What would appear to be deficient, however, is a cultural self-awareness based on national rationality. In particular, people seem to have difficulty identifying national rationality as it relates to the political relations between nations, and national reality in terms of how citizens engage with their own political lives. That is, emotionalism leads people to act against their own and their country's self-interest. The confusion between the two, with neither besting the other, in some cases leads people to admire that old Red Guard reprobate on the other side of the Pacific. These tyros end up being little better than those rednecks from the Rust Belt. To apply a famous line from a famous person, they are too young, too simple. This is a jocular reference to former party leader Jiang Zemin, who once berated a young Hong Kong journalist for their naivete. Here, the Chinese transliteration of too young, too simple is a play on Zhang's Yangzhou accented English pronunciation. In the original, Zhang added, sometimes naive. At the same time, the appeal of our own political system is insufficient, resulting in an insufficient or weak sense of identity. The result is a strange contradiction between citizens and civic awareness. But then again, although the Great Qing dynasty was enmeshed with China, they weren't really one and the same thing at all. You communists rule the rivers and the mountains, a traditional expression that indicates control over the geopolitical and civilizational realm of China. You gorge yourselves on the rivers and the mountains, literally eat or consume the rivers and mountains. But when your rivers and mountains are in trouble, suddenly we're expected to pull together and help you protect the rivers and mountains, as well as join as one to overcome present difficulties that have resulted from the trade war. What utter nonsense. There is discussion in the non-official media that although certain figures are seemingly busying themselves in negotiations, they are really acting as though they aren't Chinese. Instead, they devote their real energies to coming up with ways to convenience the other side. Oddly enough, this is not all that surprising. After all, this is the kind of scenario you should expect in a nation that lacks a coherent and unifying focus. Moreover, putting aside debates about identity and what being Chinese really means, given the present situation, there are those prophets who each say their piece and in their proud justifications end up finding no common ground for compromise. Let me repeat my previous observation. A nation's maturity relies on the nurturing authority of its intellectual elite, and for their wisdom to have a full sway, they require a freedom of spirit. All the red noise and attempts to silence it cannot detract from the realities of shared human ideas. It is necessary to rejecting the misguided folly and pridefulness of any and all absolute authorities. In China, it is necessary to call for an end to the ever-increasing censorship and to give freedom of expression back to the intelligentsia. For only then, and only with the painstaking work of generations, can the motherlode of Chinese civilization be regenerated and nurtured, its role protected and its relevance strengthened. Only then will it be possible to face unfolding possibilities with clear-sightedness, or to be able to respond calmly to immediate challenges so that we can apply ourselves to practical service in the world. At present, the authorities repeatedly claim that despite the trade war, they will not change the basic national policy of reform and the open door. They will not slacken their efforts to pursue economic development via continued open door exchange, and they reaffirm their determination to work collectively to protect the multilateral system. Echoing this stand, a series of related policies have been announced, so there seems to be a measure of certainty. This should be regarded as further evidence of the open door. It's a particularly Chinese kind of developmental path dependence. Yet despite all the talk, we have yet to see any actual internal reforms. Though the heavens may resound with thunder, only a few drops of rain are falling. Despite all the expressions of sincerity from the authorities, the lack of practical results leaves people cold, and with no choice but to look on from the sidelines, unconvinced. And so that's why I have offered here my 8 immediate hopes, a series of concrete policy suggestions that I believe to be of timely relevance. Let's just see what happens. Forget all the pretty talk about you being willing and able to take action. We'd be delighted if you manage to implement just one of the 8 hopes. If you carry out 3 or 4, we'll sing your praises and bless you in our hearts. Now, if you manage all 8, then the whole of China will rejoice rapturously. Earlier this year, the Supremo said a series of impressive policy measures would be launched to mark the 40th anniversary of the reform and open door. Well, we've already passed the 6-month mark, and although we are still wanting to believe, we're waiting. And furthermore, while I'm at it, let's take the opportunity to say there are only 50 to 60 households in Langjihai village in Shaanxi, and the place only has a population of over 100 people, where Xi Jinping spent 7 supposedly formative years. Nowadays, as part of the state-manufactured Xi cult, Liangjihe is accorded the status of a sacred site. But despite such modest statistics, the place boasts a representative office in Shanghai, along with an exhibition space for showcasing local agricultural produce. It's obvious that the unassuming and frugal farmers didn't come up with any of this themselves. Rather, one imagines that the whole performance is being stage-managed by a duet of bureaucrats and businessmen, each in hot pursuit of their own ends. Then there was a report informing us that the Supreme People's Procuratorate was creating the 12309 Disciplinary Investigative Service Center. The party secretary of Liangjihe, a place that has absolutely nothing to do with any of it, was invited to attend the ribbon-cutting ceremony in 2018. On the day of Beijing in early July, along with all the research topics devoted to the personality cult and leader worship, I have this to say. They are antediluvian. They fly in the face of progress and are an affront to credulity. They are grotesque, cringeworthy, and much, much more. As for all of this to do, it's simply too much, too excessive, over the top, as those involved vie to outdo each other. All of these things serve to drag us back into the dark ages of fearfulness and deprivation. That's all I've got to say for now. We'll see what fate has in store. Only heaven can judge the nation's fortunes. July 2018. Zhangrun.